Let's jump right into it, Bruce. You being a security expert, how important is security right now with regards to operating systems, especially with regards to open source?
Well, if you think about the promise of the internet, it's to mirror everything we do in the real world. We want to have commerce and have conversations and meetings and discussions. And security is critical to everything there. And so really the limits of security become the limits of the internet. If we can't do it securely, we're not going to do it. So security is very important.
How secure is it currently, in your opinion?
You know, there's good news and bad news. The bad news is there's lots of problems with operating system security, with network security, with computer security. The good news is that most of it works pretty much okay most of the time. So there's a lot of technical problems, but operationally, mostly we're doing pretty well.
A lot of pundits tend to say that open source is a very secure system. Would you agree with that?
You know, open source and security have an interesting relationship. What makes a system secure is a lot of smart people looking at it. And there are two basic ways to get that. One is you can hire them all and have them look at your operating system very carefully. And the other way is you could put it out there in the open and let anybody who wants to look at it. Both of those methodologies work. The open source methodology seems to work better right now, but it's not at all obvious. If a company like Microsoft wanted to, they could hire 100 security experts to analyze their code. The open source model tends to be cheaper, more distributed, and works better in that regard. There's nothing magical about open source that makes it more secure. It's the fact that a lot of smart people are looking at it. There are a lot of open source products, little niche products, that nobody's evaluated. They're not more secure.
But do you think that open source might become more vulnerable with its growing popularity?
Well, there is the notion of the popular operating systems get the vulnerabilities, right? Microsoft has been getting a lot of attacks, both because their software isn't very good and because they're the market leader. I mean, if you were an attacker, you get the most bang for your buck by attacking Microsoft. So as open source competitors like Linux get more popular, they're going to be juicier targets. But the underlying core is still there. So Linux is designed more securely. I mean, yes, there's going to be all sorts of bugs, but the methodology of finding them, of fixing them, and even of making sure they never get out in the releases is more robust. So sure, as an operating system gets more popular, it'll get more vulnerable. But I think Linux is going to do better than Microsoft, even if it's more popular.
Now let's get into the deep end. A lot of people, a lot of the general public, would, when you say to them, what is a hacker? And they've seen the movies, they think a hacker's a guy who breaks into machines. That's a notion which isn't completely accurate. How would you properly describe what a hacker is?
Yeah, unfortunately, hacker is a term that's changed definition. The original meaning of a hacker is someone who goes into systems and tries to understand them. So you can imagine someone who would hack automobile engines. Right? How do they work? How do I make them work better? You know, how can I tweak them? And that notion really started automobile engines, moved to model railroads, and then to computers. And a hacker traditionally is someone who's trying to understand how a system works. And often that means taking the system apart. Now, over the past decade or so, the term hacker has come to mean someone who breaks into systems maliciously. And unfortunately, I think we've lost that debate, that trying to reclaim the word hacker to its original meaning is not going to work, because the media, the popular belief is that hackers are the bad guys. So I think we give up at this time. I mean, hackers right now are the bad guys. And we need some other word for the good guys trying to understand how systems work.
Any suggestions?
Oh, I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, we think of them as scientists, as researchers, as engineers, right? Madame Curie was a hacker. I mean, she hacked nuclear energy. How does it work? You know, Thomas Edison is a great example of a hacker. He just tried lots of things to figure out what would work best. You know, I don't know if there is a better term. And there's a good hacker and a bad hacker.
Then what is a cracker?
Well, a cracker is what the good hackers want the press to call the bad hackers. Right? During the linguistic battle for the term hacker, the good guys invented this new term cracker, which we want to be used to describe the bad hackers. It didn't catch on, nobody uses it, but that's what a cracker is.
Let's just focus our attention on viruses. Are there viruses hitting open source? And if not, why not?
Well, there are a few. I mean, there have been Linux viruses over the past few years. Very, very few. I think it's simply popularity. If you're a virus writer, your goal is to infect lots and lots of systems. And you're going to do better by picking the operating system that has the lion's share of the marketplace. Now, you certainly could write viruses for Linux. You could write them for Macintosh. But for the most part, people don't bother. And it's not some magical security aura around those operating systems. It's that they're not very popular. So if you write a virus, it's not going to spread very far. Now, that's a defense. Right? My wife uses a Macintosh, and she ignores all the security vulnerabilities I have to deal with. And she's more secure because of it. If you use Linux, you don't have to worry about a lot of vulnerabilities, and you're more secure because of it.
Could one say you're either more secure or perhaps being a bit too overconfident about what you're currently using?
You know, it's a little bit of both. I mean, again, my wife uses a Macintosh. She's not overconfident. She's rightfully smug. She has every reason to be overconfident. Right? The viruses, the worms, the attackers, they don't target her. You know, we put up a personal firewall, and you just don't see the vulnerabilities. Nothing's going after her. So sure, I mean, there is some false sense of security in that a targeted bad guy, right, someone who wants to break into a particular company would go after their operating system regardless of what it is. But for the internet epidemics, the things that attack lots and lots of people, you know, Windows is the vulnerable operating system.
Security these days is seen not only as a generic term, but one of the buzzwords all across the world since 9/11. I believe you were brought in to consult with regards to airport security in the States after 9/11.
I've been doing a lot of general security. It's interesting, but the methodology, the way of thinking, the systemic way of looking at security that we developed in the computer world applies to the non-computer world. And it's a new paradigm, it's a new way of thinking. So I've been doing a lot of work on airline security, on terrorism, on securing borders. Because there's a way of modeling security that you don't see a lot of when you look at traditional ways of viewing those problems. And I think it's surprising. I think we in the computer world have a lot to teach the non-computer security. And conversely, they have a lot to teach us. I mean, there's a lot to be learned by making those disciplines closer. Because in the end, it's all about human security. I mean, there are different technologies, there are different methodologies, there are different techniques, but you're really securing against people and people wanting to do bad things. So the things we learn in the computer world affect airlines. The things they've learned in the airline industry over the past decades affect computers. So we can really teach each other a lot.
What has one learned through increased security required on all levels, from ground up all the way through to computers?
Well, I think we've learned that most security measures don't work. And a lot of security is simply selling to the public the idea of false security. I mean, airline security is a great example. Pretty much everything that's been done since 9/11 is a complete waste of time, with two exceptions: reinforcing the cockpit door and teaching passengers to fight back. I mean, everything else is a red herring. ID checks, the background checks, a lot of the baggage screening. I think that's all mostly a waste of money. And I say that because I look at security as a system. I look at the weakest link. I mean, if you spend billions of dollars defending your airplanes and the terrorists move to shopping malls, you've wasted your money. You haven't actually solved the problem. And so there's an example of something we've learned, and we know this in the computer world. We know security is as strong as the weakest link. In the computer world, we get that. We know it makes no sense to increase the key length of the cryptography if the operating system is bad. Now, we know the bad guys are going to go in through the vulnerabilities, and that fixing something else isn't going to make it better. So I think we've learned that most security really is a waste of money. We've also learned that security is measured not by how well it works, but how well it fails. that all security fails, and it has to fail well. Right? We see that working in computers. I mean, an operating system vulnerability can leave you wide open to attack. Right? There's an example of a failure that's failing badly. And we know that, and we need to fix that. In the real world, there's a lot more attention paid to failing well. Right? If this security measure fails, we have a backup measure, which is why you see at airlines different levels of security, the notion of defense in depth. We don't really have that on the internet yet. We need to get that. So there are two examples of sort of things we've learned in either area. We're sort of moving back and forth.
When we talk of security, you've said that ID checks, background checks, isn't really solving the problem. Then what exactly is ID checks really doing? Is it a lot of people in, let's say, for example, certain free movements would say that it's taking away freedom as opposed to the security side of things. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think ID checks are primarily a way of looking like you're secure. I mean, I had to show a photo ID to get into this building to participate in this conference. Now, what did that actually achieve? Someone looked at my ID, right? What we want is we want to figure out intentionality. Right? Is this person going to do something bad? And that's very hard to do. Checking an ID is a panacea. It's a way to pretend we're doing something. So I think primarily it's a way to look like we're doing something. I think it is a surveillance measure. I think it does take away freedoms, but I don't think that's the purpose. I don't think the governments are saying, let's take away some freedoms. I think they actually think that an ID check is improving security. And I think they think that because they don't look at security as a system. They don't understand how ID checks fit in with the overall security posture. So I think primarily it's ignorance. I don't see a lot of maliciousness. Yes, it's taking away freedoms. Yes, it's taking away liberties. But I don't think that's the point. I think that's just a side effect.
Part of the methodology of open source is about communication, transfer of information. With regards to that, again, does it make your job a lot harder? Because with increased communication, security is a hindrance.
Well, there's always a trade-off between security and usability. Right? Security is always a hindrance, whatever it is you're doing, whether it's a lock on your front door or a protocol that stops you from communicating when you want to. I mean, security is always going to be a hindrance to what you want to do. And that's always the battle we fight. Right? Corporations have that problem. The security officer wants to install this kind of countermeasure, and the company says, no, our employees need to do their job. So there's always that tension. And I think that's a good thing. Right? Security is always a trade-off. We trade off what we get versus what we give up. And if we give up too much, then it's not worth it. Now, I mean, you could put a lock on your house, throw away the key, and your house is secure. But you can't get in. So you install a key. Now, a key is a vulnerability. Someone can steal the key, and they can break into your house. But that's a vulnerability we accept willingly because we need the usability. Right? A VPN is another example. We put a VPN on a network, which is basically a hole through the firewall, because we need access. Now, that hole adds a vulnerability. We do our best to secure it, but we need the access. So, yes, as we have more communication, as the internet becomes more useful, security becomes more of a hindrance, but that's not a bad thing. That's success.
What would you say is the most outlandish security breach with regards to computers that you've heard of, and perhaps if you have a story to share similarly with regards to open source?
I have a company called Counterpane Internet Security, and we do security monitoring. So we monitor customers' networks and in real time watch for breaches. And we see all sorts of things. The most interesting story that I like to use is we're monitoring a major airline, and we see someone trying to break into the human resources server from the inside. So we call up the airline, and we say, hi, this is Counterpane. Here's the IP address of one of your computers. We don't know where it is on your network, but you do. But you need to go to that computer right now, look at the person sitting in front of it, because he's breaking into your human resources server. The airline did that. It turned out to be a reservations agent working in an office in Mexico City. And that person was trying to break into the corporate network. And the airline caught the person doing it. They terminated him. And there's an example of an insider attack. And insider attacks are very nasty because they are actually inside the corporate network. And we at Counterpain caught that because we monitor. And so there's an example of an interesting security story. And these are security stories that never make the news. Right? Most stories you never see in the press. The airline didn't press charges. They just fired the employee, and that was that.
To the end user at home, and that we talk about open source, and part of the beauty of it is that with free and open source, you're able to download an OS off the net, don't pay a cent. But now, getting back to the aspect of vulnerability and viruses, how does an end user make sure that when he's downloading something which is free and for nothing initially, that he might not be downloading something which might also have a virus?
And sure, and that's possible. I mean, you could download a program that has a Trojan or a virus attached. The way to avoid that is to only download from reputable sources. I mean, there are mechanisms, signing code, and they work for an intelligent user. But for an average user, that's going to be too complicated. What I would recommend is only download from reputable sources, and to be careful, not to download from anywhere. And that could be a worry regardless of your software. You're surfing on the net, and you're told to see this, you have to download this Java plugin. Well, that could be malicious. You have to be careful. Only go from reputable sources. I actually think it's worth paying a little bit of money to get a CD-ROM of the operating system from one of the companies that package it. I mean, you're paying a little bit of money, but you're buying support, you're buying security, you're buying reliability, you're buying the assurance that it's not a Trojan copy of the operating system. Alternatively, you go on the internet to one of the sites that is well known for having good code. I download free code from twocows.com. And not often, but once in a while there's a program I want. I've never had a problem. They're a reputable source. If there was a problem, they would fix it quickly. They would alert you. Going out anywhere, that's where you have to worry. But, I don't think it's that bad. I know lots of people who download things, and I've never heard horror stories. If you download hacker tools, a lot of them are Trojans. But if you're downloading an MP3 player, and you're downloading a free game off a reputable site, you're downloading a copy of Linux, the incidences of hacked versions are very, very rare. It's mostly okay. And there's an example of, the balance of security. There are all sorts of theoretical problems, but for the most part, everything's okay. It's sort of a surprise, actually.
Have you been planning to, with regards to your own business and perhaps in the security community, have you been looking into providing open source packages with regards to security and antivirus software for those platforms?
Well, right now we monitor open source products. We monitor the Linux operating system. We monitor Apache. We use Snort, an open source IDS, when we monitor some of our customers. So Counterpain has always been product agnostic. That we like to say we monitor everything. And as open source products get more popular, we're going to monitor them. We use Linux in our monitoring box because it's much easier for us to control it and make it more secure. We can strip out the things we don't need. So already we deal with open source. And many of our customers are open source savvy. And they are using open source products in concert with traditional commercial products. And most networks are a hybrid. Right? Apache is very popular. Snort is gaining popularity as an IDS. When a company comes to us and says, we're using the ISS intrusion detection system, we say, great, we'll monitor it. When they come to us and say, we don't have an IDS, well, we want you to manage one, we say, well, use Snort. It's free, and it's just as good as the other ones. So, I'm a strong proponent of open source. I think it's done great things. I think it's done more to improve Microsoft security than anything else, just by being competition.
Are developing world communities more, should we say, vulnerable from a security perspective?
I don't think they are. The attackers go where the money is. A lot of the phishing attacks, for example, seem to target the United States and Europe, the countries where people have lots of credit cards and don't pay attention very much. A lot of the attacks come from the developing world because because the computer crime laws aren't as sophisticated as they are in the U.S. or Europe or Japan. I think we're all vulnerable, and I don't think there are a lot of national boundaries. The Internet, one of the things the Internet does is it breaks down boundaries. We're all in it together. So I wouldn't say that the developing world is more vulnerable. I think the developing world is more likely to use the open source alternatives, which is going to make them more secure. And sometimes you see that in things like telephony. The developing world can leapfrog what the United States or Europe, all the infrastructure we've put in place, a lot of it legacy, a lot of it insecure, and go to the new stuff. And in doing that, they actually get more security. You see lots of examples of countries doing major buys of open source, major installations. And I think that's a good thing. I think they're bypassing a lot of legacy that we in the U.S. are really stuck with.
I want to quickly touch on a side note here, and again, many end users talk about it, it's spam. Is spam a security problem? Is it merely the proliferation of email addresses to the wrong people? How does one combat spam and get rid of it forever? Is it possible?
Well, you probably can't get rid of it forever. There are lots of products that combat spam. I use a service called Postini. There are others. And what Postini does is it goes through my mail and cleans out the spam. I love it. I get 2 spams a week. There are internet appliances you can buy. You can plug into your network to clean out the spam. There's end-user software you can buy that'll go through your mailbox and clean out the spam. And there are things like Postini, which are other networks, which filter your mail before you get it. So the spam problem, I think, is being dealt with. It's a reliability problem. It's an availability problem. It's a time-wasting problem. And it's a security problem when spam is malicious, when it entices people to fall for phishing attacks, to give away their usernames and passwords. So it's often a vector for other crimes. Spam is an enormous problem, which is why you're seeing so many companies trying to solve it. But I think the companies are doing a good job. If you are an individual and you're using a large ISP, they have spam filters. Whether it's AOL or MSN or Earthlink, they will offer you spam filters, and they work really well. If you're a corporation, there are corporate solutions. You have to pay for it, unfortunately, but it's worth it. Your workers are spending, half an hour a day cleaning out spam. That's time they're wasting. So spam is a big problem, but there are solutions now, and I think that's a good thing.
Security and the future. How do you foresee the world from the real world security side all the way through the computer side in the next 3 years?
I think there's going to be a lot of security problems and a lot of security overreactions. We saw that with September 11th. There was a huge overreaction in the United States to security because of that one event. And I think we are vulnerable to panic, to hysteria. And what we need are reasoned reactions to security that deal with the threats as they are, not as we fear they are. And what I think is going to happen in the next few years are more overreactions, both in the real world and in the computer world. And I think that would be a mistake, and I think it'll hurt us all.
Thank you once again for appearing on Go Open, and you will hear from us soon.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.